Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome, everyone, depending on where you're at. This is Faith, Lies, and Confusion. I'm your host, Godless Reggie. How are you doing? Today, I'm doing a different stream than what I normally do. Usually, my streams are based on religion. Today, we're doing a stream that I started previously a few weeks ago called The Rise of the American Pretendians. And this is part two. I decided to do two parts to it because I feel like the first episode that I did was kind of from a black person's point of view. Obviously, I am black. So, what I was saying basically was from things that I know growing up. What I mean by that is growing up, there's not too many black people I've grown up with or I'm related to or known and met that haven't said that they have some form of Native American in them. They never can prove it. What the episode mostly was about is why we tend to think that. It also had celebrities on it as well with their DNA test results. Out of all of them, only one of them had one small amount of Native American ancestry in them. Um, Most of the people who thought that they did, when they did their DNA test, they found out that it came back to being European ancestry. So that was a normal thing growing up. I heard a lot of people talk about either they were Cherokee mostly, um, Choctaw, Chippewa, and Blackfeet. Those were the most popular ones. Um, I've come to find out recently uh, from conversation and research and things like that that we're not the only group that thinks that. We didn't even make that up, actually. White people did. Um, White Americans made that up. Um, they took it to a different level. They did it for financial gain and things like that. With us, it was more of disassociating yourself with anything African. With them, it was more for financial gain. To be honest with you, if you're doing something, if you're running a scheme and you're pretending to be something for some money, I understand it. If you just do it just to try to be something that you're not, in my opinion, you're weird. So let me do a little bit of reading, pull up some information that I have obtained. And again, thank you everybody for stopping by. Good morning again, everybody. So the term pretendian is often used as a derogatory label to describe individuals who falsely claim Native American ancestry or heritage, usually for personal, social, or financial gain, without legitimate or verifiable ties to Native communities. These individuals may fabricate or exaggerate their background, sometimes called Indian bloodlines, or native culture connections that do not exist. This issue has been a point of contention within Native American communities for years because such claims can dilute or undermine the experiences and struggles of indigenous people, particularly in a context where real Native Americans often face issues of marginalization, land theft, and erasure of culture. The term pretendian is typically used in criticism of people who claim American ancestry without any evidence or legitimate connection to recognized Native communities, appropriate Native culture by wearing traditional regalia, adopting Native symbols, or using Native spiritual practices without understanding or respecting their culture, use their claimed ancestry to gain access to resources, grants, or opportunities reserved for Native Americans. These kinds of plays are problematic not only because they perpetrate stereotypes, but also because they can take opportunities away from other Native people. It's important to note that Native communities are highly diverse, and many nations or tribes have specific requirements to prove membership, such as lineage or tribal enrollment. The discussion around pretendians also ties into broader conversations about identity, uh, racialization, sorry, I'm stumbling through that word, and what it means to truly belong to a cultural or ethnic group. Native Americans identify in particular is identity in particular is often rooted in community culture and shared experiences that go far beyond simple genetic markers or distant ancestry. Wow. So basically, that's kind of sums up what I said, just in a broader view than what I did. You're taking resources and things like that from actual people who deserve it, who their ancestors have been through a lot, like mine have. They already been put on reservations and things like that. You've done so much stuff to these people, and then you want to turn back around and take it from them. Well, all of this basically is based on something that happened in history, right? It's called the Dawes Act. I'm going to read a little bit on that so people can understand what this is or what this is about, actually. Again, shout out to everybody that stops by. Okay. The Dawes Act of 1887, also known as the General Allotment Act or the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, regulated land rights on tribal territories within the United States. Named after Secretary Henry L. Dawes of Massachusetts, it authorized the President of the United States to subdivide Native American tribal communal land holdings into allotments for Native American heads of families and individuals. This would convert traditional systems of land tenure into a government imposed system of private property by forcing Native Americans to assume a capitalist and proprietary relationship with property did not that did not previously exist in their cultures. Before private property could be dispensed, the government had to determine which Indians were eligible for allotments, which propelled an official search for federal definition of Indianness, which is crazy. Although the act was passed in 1887, the federal government implemented the Dawes Act on a tribe by tribe basis thereafter. For example, in 1895, Congress passed the Hunter Act, which administered the Dawes Act among the Southern Ute. The nominal purpose of the act was to protect the property of the natives as well as to propel their absorption into American mainstream. Native Americans who were deemed to be mixed blood were granted United States citizenship, while others were detribalized. Between 1887 and 1934, Native Americans ceded control of about 100 million acres of land. As of 2019, the United States has a total of 1.9 billion acres of land, or about two-thirds of the land base they held in 1887. As a result of the act, the loss of land ownership and the breakup of traditional leadership of tribes produced potential negative culture and social effects that have since prompted some scholars to consider the act as one of the most destructive United States policies for Native Americans in history. This is deep. Um, I wasn't aware of this when I decided to start streaming about quote unquote pretendians. I thought it was just a identity crisis among Black people, not knowing where they're from and things like that. But obviously, this is a whole nother level of conspiracy, uh, theft by deception, and a lot of other crazy things. I'm gonna read more into it. Um, I'm gonna bring some video up as well, but I want to keep reading this because I'm actually learning on the fly with this shit too. I wasn't aware of this. So the five civilized tribes, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole in Indian Territory, were initially exempt from the Dawes Act. The Dawes Commission was established in 1893 as a delegation to register members of tribes for allotment of lands. They came to define tribal belongings in terms of blood quantum. However, because there was no method of determining precise bloodlines, commission members often assigned full blood status to Native Americans who were perceived as poorly assimilated or legally incompetent, and mixed blood status to Native Americans who were mostly resembled whites, regardless of how they identify culturally. The Curtis Act of 1898 extended the provision of the Dawes Act to the five civilized tribes, required the abolition of their governments and dissolution of tribal courts, allotment of communal lands to individuals registered as tribal members, and sale of lands declared surplus. This land was an outgrowth of the land rush of 1889 and completed the extension of Indian land claims in that territory. This violated the promise of the United States that the Indian Territory will remain Indian land in perpetuity, completed the obliteration of tribal land titles in Indian Territory, and prepared for admission of the territory land to the Union as the state of Oklahoma. Terrible, terrible, terrible. Typical United States shit. Sorry for whoever I didn't bring this up. Again, this is what I just read. Um, the United States, in my opinion, has a history of reneging, giving people things, making treaties, and then going back on their word. The second you try to complain about it, oh, you're communist and God did this for you, God did that for you, blah, 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 blah. It's just typical United States shit. They've done so much to the Native Americans. Genocide, disease, theft. Um, I speak on Native Americans a lot. Many of them I do respect because they are smart enough to realize that their first introduction into religion, as we know it today, was through colonization and what was done to them. So I respect them on that level to try their hardest to keep their identity, even though that has nothing to do with the conversation today. I just wanted to say that. Shout out to the Native American people, especially who are trying their hardest to keep their culture intact. Um, and shout out to the people who are pointing their finger and pointing people out who are doing culture inappropriation and trying to steal their funds that were given back to them. So I want to watch a couple videos to to speak on some of what I'm talking about right now. So here's a video that is called "What Are Pretendians?"
They've been called wannabes.
Identity thief.
Race shifter.
They have been called indigenauts.
Oh, playing Indian is another one as well that we use.
Pretendians.
Pretendian, short for pretendian, meaning someone who falsely claims to be indigenous but can't prove it in any meaningful way.
They first tried to get rid of us, right? And then they tried to assimilate us. And when all of those things failed, they said, well, if we can get rid of you, we'll just become you.
Pretendian is a controversial term. Some people have decided that pretend is too gentle of a word, that they're actually doing something a lot more dangerous than just playing pretend.
Cultural appropriation has moved on to actual identity appropriation.
There's always been pretendians. I think a really famous example in Indigenous communities would be Iron Eyes Cody.
People start pollution. People can stop it.
I feel like we've seen such a higher frequency in recent years because now the benefits that people can reap from claiming an Indigenous identity have increased tenfold.
For the first time in Canadian history, there are advantages to being Indigenous. And in an act of colonial violence, pretendians are exploiting this moment, stealing much-needed space, opportunity, and benefits from actual Indigenous peoples.
People can get job opportunities. They can get scholarships and bursaries. They get roles in television and film.
You know, applying for grants. In many cases, you apply for a job in government or a big corporation. There's a box there that says, are you Indigenous, Métis, Inuit, etc. You tick it off and nobody follows up. That means you have a head start in getting a good job.
Industries where you can capitalize on an Indigenous aesthetic are particularly vulnerable, I think, to pretendian claims.
There may even be psychological relief for those making false claims.
People do not want to feel complicit in colonialism, in the kind of violence that has been done to Indigenous.
I have wanted to pause this for a second because I want to touch on something I said earlier in the stream that, if you're running around here and you're claiming indigenous status for profit, I don't blame you. It's wrong. Uh, but my whole thing is if you're going to do something in life, do it for a reason. Don't just run around here just saying that you native and you're not. You have no ties, you have no proof to it for nothing. At least these people that are, you know, on the other side of the spectrum, at least they're doing it for profit. They're wrong, and they are misappropriating culture and trying to steal funds. But the point of this stream was to emphasize that some of these people are doing it for cash. A lot of y'all out there putting hot glue sticks with feathers and shit in your hair just to not be black. These motherfuckers is getting paid for doing this shit. So if you're gonna do something for a reason, in my opinion.
Indigenous peoples. They want to feel that they're the good guys, that their ancestors were the good guys. There's a real incentive to say, I am part Mi'kmaq, I am part Cree, I am part Cherokee. And then people don't have to feel like they are literally living in these lands and benefiting based on the dispossession and violence that happened to Indigenous people and the theft of Indigenous land.
False claims aren't always intentional or malicious, at least in the beginning. They're often the result of unchecked family lore and wishful thinking.
You hear from your uncle, your grandparents that, yeah, supposedly great uncle so-and-so was part native. And it gets passed down through the generations till basically people just believe it without taking the time to accurately assess its validity.
Pretendians should not be confused with people who are trying to reconnect with their indigenous heritage in the aftermath of cultural genocide.
There's a big difference between somebody whose parent left the reserve or the community, or whose grandparent was forcibly relocated or went to residential school, but you still have cousins, aunties, uncles, grandparents, and somebody who is looking back to 1640.
The number of our ancestors increases exponentially the further that we look back. We all come from 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, and so on. If you go back 20 generations, we're talking thousands of ancestors. Today, there are cases of people scouring historical records claiming to be indigenous based on ancestors many generations ago, who may or may not have been authentically indigenous. So what does it really mean to prioritize one ancestor in a family tree that's otherwise filled with Europeans?
You've got many generations of your family and ancestors living as white people, not subject to the laws that Indigenous people were subject to, the oppressive, racist hierarchy laws. And then you're going to claim one ancestor among all of those. It's really a way of disowning one's white privilege and the experience of many generations of one's family.
Pretendianism harms Indigenous peoples and communities in numerous ways.
They're taking grants, they're taking monies designed for Native advancement, Native arts, Native business, and using it for their own expenses.
We think of some of the classic cases that we've seen in the last few years, a famous writer, a famous director, a famous attorney. We see people that are normatively attractive and intelligent according to settler white standards. They look and move and talk the way that settlers want people to talk, right? They don't want to have to work hard to relate to people who they are actually really uncomfortable relating to. And so it allows them to say that they're doing inclusion, that they're making substantive changes, when in fact, they're just bringing people in and holding people up and putting people on platforms that are just white people, basically, but they're maybe dressing up as an Indian or putting on a story of historical trauma, showing that they have overcome. The implication being, why aren't all these other Indigenous people overcoming? When in fact, these people haven't overcome anything that Indigenous people have had to overcome because they're white people.
So let me push pause on that again. I just had to, speak on what she said. So, if anybody's getting lost, basically what she's saying is you wasn't with me when I was shooting in the gym. You didn't go through the struggles that we went through. You didn't get put on reservations. You didn't get put in these Catholic schools. You didn't go through none of the things that colonizers put these people through. Now all of a sudden your great 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 grandpappy was Chickasaw. Now all of a sudden you are too. No, you're only doing that shit because you want the benefits that come with it, right? So I can tell that the lady has a lot of passion in her and what she's saying. I think she's a little upset, rightfully so. because clearly she is native and she sees these things happening on a first-hand basis, or clearly better than I do. So I can tell that it really upsets her that this is happening. But maybe she's going a little bit too far with saying that they're getting rid of their white privilege. Um, I don't really think that they're trying to deny it or get rid of it. I think they're just pushing pause on that. Let me go get my money when nobody else is around. Then I'm gonna go back and get that. Um, we've seen it happen with other races too. I forget the lady's name. She was somewhere out in like out west, like in Seattle or something like that. Rachel Dolan or some shit like that. She was actually pretending to be partially African American when it came out that her parents exposed her, that both of them were actually white people, and she just was really into black culture and into black guys. She also was doing it for reasons of monetary gain. She was making herself available for jobs that otherwise she would not qualify for because she wouldn't be black. So in that case, I didn't like that because she's taking a job from someone else, in these days we're always saying, oh, black jobs, blah 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 blah. Well, that was a black job that someone else took, because she was pretending to be black. So I didn't really like that. So I can understand the lady that's in the video, with the passion that she has about her people and what has been done to them and how people are ripping them off right now. um I wanted to touch on this because African American people, and especially if they're predominantly from the East Coast, a lot of times they won't know things like that because there's not as many reservations east as there is west. I'm not saying that there's not none. I am aware that there are native reservations in upstate New York, Western New York, um, but typically you don't see a lot of that out here or in the Midwest. Let me get back to the video. I'm just rambling on and on.
It's extremely frustrating as I think every Indigenous person who has lived through trauma, generational trauma, ongoing colonialism. We don't get to just pick up and put down Indigenous identities and it benefits us. And it makes me angry that any actual Indigenous person also has to feel like that they have to prove themselves in this way now.
Determining somebody's belonging to an Indigenous nation is a matter of Indigenous sovereignty. It's about our ability to choose who our people are by whatever means we see fit. Unfortunately, proving that somebody isn't Indigenous is pretty complicated. But
Wait a minute. I have to chime in again. He don't look indigenous to me. He looks just like the people that they're talking about. You can't tell me that that man is not majority white. I'm not gonna believe it. I'm not gonna believe he's not.
proving that you are Indigenous can be pretty straightforward.
People will say, oh, you're Indigenous. Where are you from? Maybe I know your grandpa or something like that. And then this exchange happens where, yes, we're chatting and we're getting to know each other. But through that also, I'm telling them who I am, who I'm accountable to, where my knowledge comes from. Those are all, I think, part of that exchange. And I think some people would call that protocol.
Indigenous issues are taking up space in the mainstream more than ever before. Pretendian exposés are now nationwide scandals, and they seem to be happening more and more. There could be hundreds, if not thousands, of cases yet to be uncovered.
When we're having these conversations, it's also important to check in, not just with Indigenous people writ large, but displaced people who have those complex histories, who have been raising alarm bells for a really long time that we could be hurting some of our own people when we don't have these conversations with care.
In the common framing of the problem of pretendianism, people are often talking about identity and what does Indigenous identity mean? I don't think that's really fundamentally the question at play here or the problem that we are confronting. It's white people. What is their problem? Why are they intent on appropriating our identities in the same way that they have appropriated the land? They have disrupted our governance systems, right? It's one more act of colonization. We really need to turn the camera back onto the settler. Why are they continuing to appropriate every last thing and take the gaze off of Indigenous people? Because we are not the problem in this issue.
Well, I guess she said it. I actually like her. She's a gangster native. I like that in her. She's not a fucking joke. She's serious about what she say. Um, and I like her. I definitely like her passion. She's not a joke. I'm gonna read some more about the Dawes Act so I can give people a little bit more information on that. What's up, Ouija 666? How are you? Thank you for stopping by as always. Okay, during the Great Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt administration passed the U.S. Indian Reorganization Act, also known as the Wheeler Howard Law, on June 18th, 1934. It prohibited any further land allotment and created a new deal for Native Americans, which renewed their rights to reorganize and self governments in order to rebuild an adequate land base. During the early 1800s, the United States federal government attempted to address what is referred to as the Indian problem. Numerous European immigrants were settling on the eastern border of the Indian territories, where most of the Native American tribes have been relocated. Conflicts between the groups increased as they competed for resources and operated according to different cultural systems. Searching for a quick solution to their problem, Commissioner of Indian Affairs William Medill proposed establishing colonies or reservations that would be exclusively for the natives, similar to those which some native tribes had created for themselves in the East. It was a form of relocation whereby the United States government would offer a transfer of the natives from current locations to areas in the region beyond the Mississippi River, which would enable settlement by European Americans in the Southeast, where there was a growing demand for access of new lands. The new policy intended to concentrate Native Americans in areas away from new settlers. During the later 19th century, Native American tribes resisted the imposition of the reservation system and engaged with the United States Army and what were called the Indian Wars in the West for decades, finally defeated by the United States military force continuing waves of new settlers. The tribes negotiated agreements to resettle on reservations. Native Americans ended up with a total of over 155 million acres of land, ranging from the arid deserts to prime agricultural land. The reservation system, while compulsory for Native Americans, allowed each tribe a claim to their new lands, protected over their territories, and the right to govern themselves, with the United States Senate to be involved only for negotiations and ratifications of treaties. The Native Americans adjusted their ways of life and tried to maintain their traditions. The traditional tribal organization, a defining characteristic of Native Americans as a social unit, became apparent to the non native communities of the United States. The tribe was viewed as a highly cohesive group led by hereditary choosing chief. No, I can't pronounce that word. It's Hereditary chosen chief who exercised powerful and influence among the members of the tribe by aging traditions. By the end of the 1800s, some of the United States stakeholders felt that assimilation of the Native Americans into American culture was a top priority and was needed for the people's very survival. This was the belief among who admired them, as well as people who thought they needed to leave behind their tribal land holdings, reservations, traditions, and ultimately their Indian identities. Senator Henry Dawes launched a campaign to rid the nation of tribalism through the virtues of private property, allowing land parcels to Indian heads of family. On February 8th, 1887, President Grover Cleveland signed the Dawes Allotment Act into law, responsible for enacting the allotment of tribal reservations into plots of land for individual households. The Dawes Act was intended by reformers to achieve six goals: breaking up tribes as a social unit, encouraging individual initiatives, furthering the progress of Native farmers, reducing the cost of Native administration, securing parts of the reservation as Indian land, and opening the remainder of the land to white settlers for profit. This shit is just so sad. as I read it. Basically, it's just a scheme to over time to re-rob them again for what you're giving them, to take their individuality from, I mean, excuse me, to make them individuals instead of being tribal people, to take the tribalization away from them. I'll read that last part to you again. And I see Ouija 666. Give me 1 second. So it had 6 goals, the Dawes Act, right? It was breaking up of the tribes as a social unit, encouraging individuals' initiatives, furthering the progress of Native farmers, reducing the cost of Native administration, securing parts of the reservations as Indian land, and opening the remainder of the land to white settlers for profit. Basically, we're trying to confuse them to get their land back out, give their land back so white settlers can come in, and to lower costs because y'all costing us too much fucking money. Sad, sad, sad. I'm about to play a video here for y'all. I'm gonna put that on pause for a minute. I'm tired of reading.
words, and those 3 words are resistance to authentication. When we're trying to authenticate somebody new who's coming into our spaces, we need to be asking questions. And asking questions is normal and it's encouraged and it's a good practice. But sometimes when you run into a pretendian or somebody you're not familiar with, it's okay to ask those questions, but sometimes you get a reaction from them. And we are going to talk about some of these reactions. The first one is defensiveness. If I'm meeting somebody new and I'm saying, hey, where are you from? And they get defensive right away, that's a warning sign. That's a big red flag, because when we're forming new relationships, we should be open and honest about who we are, where we come from, how we hold our First Nations and Métis Inuit space. Defensiveness is not good. It's a warning sign. A second red flag is to have a short, vague biography. If I'm asking somebody, hey, where are you from? Oh, I hail from Mohawk territory. That's very vague. That's not really, naming a name or not naming a community. Mohawks are actually many communities. So when somebody refuses to give you any detail and they're just saying, I'm Métis, that could mean many things from many, many places. So if they're vague and they refuse to get more specific, that's a warning sign. Another one is name dropping. Sometimes when I meet somebody and I'm attempting to authenticate them or just figure out who they are, they just totally ignore the question and then they start to name off all these people that they know. And that's a little unexpected, strange, and it's their way of trying to authenticate themselves by being in proximity to other First Nations Métis Inuit. They're saying that, hey, I'm hanging out there, I am also like them, but don't fall for that, because name dropping, that's not really a good way to get to know people, unless you're saying, this is my family. My family is, and then they start to name off their family members. But if they're saying, like, name dropping, like, I don't know, I know a hockey player or a model or some Indigenous influencer, that's a bit of a red flag. And the final one we're going to look at tonight is they tend to collect First Nations, Métis, and Inuit friends on their social media as a means of establishing credibility. For instance, you get a friend request from somebody and suddenly you have 200 and some mutual friends, but you don't really know this person. But what this person is attempting to do is they're attempting to authenticate themselves by being in proximity to other First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So if you feel like you are being used as a collectible playing card, chances are that you are. So if you don't know that person, please establish some criteria as to how you're going to accept new friends. And don't just be accepting friend requests just because they seem to have a lot of common friends. I've actually fallen victim to that a few times. And now I'm a little bit more discerning about who I accept as a friend on my social media. So just be aware of that. And this is only a partial list, a very, very tiny little portion of a huge list that we have amassed over the past few years in our investigations and research of pretendians. So if you have a suggestion or you want something, or if you have experienced something that you want to add to the list, by all means, drop it in the comments below. And we look forward to hearing from you on our next video. So see you next week.
Well, there you have it. That's straight from literally the horse's mouth. It's a shame that these people have to go through this and, check everybody that comes in their circle. Damn near run a credit check screen to see if they're authentic, because the problem is it's so big of a problem that everyone, for some reason, wants to become a pretendian. Now, I do understand, again, and I mentioned this 1,000 times till I'm blue in the face, that if you are doing this for financial gain and you are struggling, I don't blame you. I feel that if you were born in the United States, you can technically claim to be Native American. You may not be an indigenous American, but you can claim to be a Native American if you were born here. I know I'm native to this country. Am I Native American? By definition, no. I'm not. I have no Native American blood in me that I could recognize or know, but I'm actually native to this country, like most of us are. But again, it is a problem because you are stealing from people who have continuously, throughout history, have been stolen from. If this is what you're doing, um, so clearly it is a problem. Let me get back to the Dawes Act a little bit. I have plenty of more videos to show too from other people's point of views and perspective about this issue. Eventually, I'm going to touch on the $5 Indian topic as well because that's a topic I've heard about for the past 3 or 4 years. Let's see if it has any validity. Okay, so I'm gonna go right back from the point where I was reading at. Okay, the act facilitated assimilation. They would be more Americanized as the government allowed the reservations and the Indians adapted the substance farming. The primary model at that time, Native Americans held specific ideologies pertaining to tribal land. Some natives began to adapt to the culture. They adopted the values of the dominant society and saw land as real estate to be bought and developed. They learned how to use their land effectively to become prosperous farmers. As they were inducted as citizens of the country, they would shed those of their discourses and ideologies presumed to be uncivilized and exchange them for ones that allowed them to become industrious, self supporting citizens, and finally rid themselves of their need for government supervision. So, obviously, the act happened. It taught them to look at land as real estate. People that are indigenous to any land, they don't look at it like that. They look at it like, it's for the people that are there and, it's what the creator gave them. Provisions to the Dawes Act. The important provision of the Dawes Act were a head of family will receive a grant of 160 acres. A single person or orphan under 18 years of age will receive a grant of 80 acres, and persons under the age of 18 will receive 40 acres each. The allotments would be held in trust by the United States government for 25 years. Eligible Native Americans have 4 years to select their land. Afterwards, the selection will be made for them by the Secretary of the Interior. Every member of the bands or tribes receiving a land allotment is subject to laws of the state or territory in which they reside. Every Native American who receives a land allotment and has adopted the habits of civilized life, lives separate and apart from the tribe, is bestowed with the United States citizenship without any manner impairing or otherwise affecting the right of any such Indian to tribal or other property. The Secretary of the Interior could issue rules to assure equal distribution of water or for irrigations among the tribes, and provided that no other appropriation or grant of water by any riparian proprietor shall be authorized or permitted to the damage of any other riparian proprietor. The Dawes Act did not apply to the territory of the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, Miami, and Peoria in the Indian Territory, Osage and Sac and Fox in the Oklahoma Territory, any of the reservations of the Seneca Nation of New York, or strip of territory in the state of Nebraska adjoining the Sioux Nation, Red Lake Ojibwe Reservation, the Osage Tribe of Oklahoma. Provisions later extended to the Wea, Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankeshaw, and Western Miami tribes by the Act of 1889. Allotment of the lands of these tribes was mandated by the Act of 1891, which amplified the provision of the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act 1891 amendments. In 1891, the Dawes Act was amended, allowed for pro data distribution when the reservation did not have enough land for each individual to receive allotments in original quantities, and provided them when land is only suitable for grazing purposes, such land be allowed in double quantities. Established criteria for inheritance does not apply to Cherokee outlet. So basically, from what I'm reading, to sum this shit all up, most of the tribes that I hear people claim that they are from, matter of fact, every last fucking one of them, that people that I personally know that they claim that they from, none of this shit apply to any of you. I'm not saying it's not for racial reasons, because clearly it probably is, because it seems like these would be the darker tribes, or the ones where you would have more black people claim, or black people would even be members, because I know for sure that the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Cherokee nations, which I think are all one and the same basically, own slaves. So maybe that's in a way of the United States government, as I read earlier in the stream, of making sure that black people, or anybody that looks black-ish, received any of these funds. But again, the black people that I know that claim to be members of these tribes anyway are visibly black, and they don't know who the actual member is, and they cannot prove that shit anyway. I've only met really one visible black person that I know offhand that can prove their native status. It's only one. I'm not going to mention her name, but there's only one. Everybody else I've ever met in my life are pretendians, unless they're Hispanic. So this is strange. So let me look at another video, and that can show the harm in some of this. Give myself a breather.
What's up, Melanated Family? This is your boy Harry from melanatedfathers.com and Melanated Fathers TV. And what we're doing today is a episode of History Matters, where we talk about a specific time in history, a specific place in history, just to give the family context on a lot of the things that we see here in our country. So today, what we are going to talk about is the creation of what has been dubbed as the $5 Indian. Now, what is a $5 Indian? I'll get into the details of how it transpired here in a second. But basically, it was a white man or a white person, basically, who paid money to get on what was called the Dawes rolls to be counted as an Indian person, which came with a lot of benefits, right? So now today, when we see a lot of casinos, and if you ever seen the Indians who run the casino, a lot of the times they're like lily white people, right? We see like Dog the Bounty Hunter has claimed he's Indian or some shit like that. So what we've seen is an influx of these Indian people who look more Caucasian. And what I'm going to do today is break down to you why that is a fact. Now, the Dawes Commission, and what it was called, was established in 1893 to enforce the General Allotment Act of 1887, or the Dawes Act as it was called, was charged with convincing tribes to cede their land to the United States and divide the remaining land into individual allotments. Now, the commission also required Indians to claim membership in only one tribe and register on the Dawes roll, what the government meant to be as like a definitive record of individuals with Indian blood, right? So the Curtis Act, which was passed in 1898, targeted the 5 civilized tribes specifically. Those 5 tribes were the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, Creek, and the Seminole Indians. Now, forcing them to basically accept allotments and register on the Dawes rolls too. Now, the 2 acts, the Curtis Act and the Dawes Act, basically came after the Civil War, when white and black men were intermarrying with Native American women So the government aimed, to help track the real Indians while accelerating efforts to assimilate Indian people into white culture. Now, by 1865, African American and white Americans were moving into the Midwest, into the Indian and Oklahoma territories, all vying for some patch of land that they can call their own, right? And live their version of what they considered to be independence. Now, the federal government poured a lot of effort and energy into the Dawes Commission, but at the same time, it was hard for both Native and American governments to keep track of who was who, right? Now, to start this process, what they would do, the Dawes Commission set up tents in Indian territory. In there, the field clerks would use written records. They would take oral testimony, just to basically generate enrollment cards for the individuals determined to have Indian blood. Now, we have people who are white, but who can trace their names back to this roll used by tribal nations to ascertain who has the right to citizenship, right? So this is really important because this basically means white people had the ability to vote at large. They had the ability to affect political rights. They had the ability to influence tribal policy, right? And they weren't even Indians, and their influence became apparent on several different issues, whether it was healthcare, education, employment. They had a say on how these particular tribes were ran, and the implications from this is pretty profound because, for all intents and purposes, it was fraud, right? So on the flip side of that, while non-natives paid to play Indian, many authentic Indians who did not trust the government chose not to register with the Dawes rolls at the time. So imagine that, right? The Dawes rolls was created to verify who they were and ultimately give them benefits, which we see being handed out now. But because they didn't trust the government, the same way a lot of people don't trust the government now, or non-white people don't trust the government now, they ultimately didn't get what was coming to them, right? So at the end of the day, the Dawes rolls forever changed the way the federal government defines Indians, and in many cases, the way Indians define themselves, because we have the casinos, and like I said, most, if not all of them, or would be considered $5 Indians. And then if you go to real Indian reservations, which I've seen a few, the people there don't look like they're benefiting from all of the money that's been generated from their tribes and different things like that, right, family? So that's been another episode of History Matters. Please share this information with your family, share this information with your friends. Please share this video as well. It's important that we get a contextual idea of everything that is taking place before us, so we can know exactly how we are to move forward, right? So this has been another episode of History Matters. Please go to melanatedfathers.com, check out the website, follow me, go to the YouTube page, which is Melanated Fathers TV. Don't forget to like.
Damn, just been talking on mute. Sorry about that. But some of the stuff that he touched on pretty much was what I was reading about the Dawes Act and things like that, and things that happened in the late 1800s, and how basically it just was a scheme, conspiracy to take back land from natives that you already stole and you sent them somewhere else, in favor of mainly white settlers. The guy that was talking, mentioned black people too. There are a significant amount of black people that I know from Oklahoma, but I highly doubt if they was doing that for the benefit of black appearing people. I don't believe that. Um, but he touched on it on basically. I think his stream probably could have been a little bit longer, and I think he could have um, gave a little bit more details on that. Um, I've been here for about an hour, so I'm not gonna, keep touching on it. But the Dawes Act really actually did happen. I'm gonna read a little bit more. Give me 1 second. Okay, so I think I read the provisions of the Curtis Act in 1898. It extended the provisions of the Dawes Act to the five civilized tribes in Indian Territory. It did away with their self-government, including tribal roots. In addition to providing allotments to of lands to tribal members, it authorized the Dawes Commission to make determinations of members when registering tribal members. Let's see if I can blow this up a little bit bigger. Maybe not. Okay, so provisions of the Burke Act. The Burke Act of 1906 amended the sections of the Dawes Act dealing with U.S. citizenship, Section 6, and the mechanism for ensuing allotments. The Secretary of Interior could force the Native Americans allottee to accept title for land. U.S. citizenship was granted unconditionally upon receipt of land allotment. The individual did not need to move off the reservation to receive citizenship. Land allotment to Native Americans was taken out of trust and subject to taxation. The Burke Act did not apply to any Native Americans in Indian Territory. Identity and detribalization. The effects of the Dawes Act were destructive on Native American sovereignty, culture, and identity, since it empowered the United States government to legally preempt the sovereign right of Indians to identify themselves, implement the specious notion of blood quantum as the legal criteria for or defining Indians, institutionalize divisions between full bloods and mixed bloods, detribalize a sizable segment of the Indian population, legally appropriate vast tracts of Indian land. The federal government initially viewed the Dawes Act as such a successful democratic experiment that they decided to further explore the use of blood quantum laws and the notion of federal recognition as the qualifying means for dispensing other resources and services such as healthcare and educational funding to Native Americans long after its passage. Under Dawes, land parcels were dispersed in accordance with perceived blood quanta. Indigenous people labeled fully blooded were allocated relatively small parcels of land deeded with trust patents over which the government retained complete control for a minimum of 25 years. Those who were labeled mixed blood were deeded larger and better tracts of land with patents and simple fee. Complete control, but were also forced to accept United States citizenship and relinquish tribal status. Additionally, Native Americans who did not meet the established criteria as being either full blood or mixed blood were effectively detribalized, being disposed of their American and Indian identity and displaced from their homelands, discarded into nebula of American otherness. While the Dawes Act is typically recognized as the primary instigation of division between tribal and detribalization, detribalized Indians, the history of detribalization in the United States actually precedes Dawes. Now let's speak on land loss. The Dawes Act ended Native American communal holding of property, with cropland often being privately owned by families or clans, by which they had ensured that everyone had a home and place in the tribe. The act was culmination of American attempts to destroy tribes and their governments and to open Indian lands to settlement by non-Indians and to be developed by railroads. Land owned by Native Americans decreased from 138 million acres in 1887 to 48 million acres in 1934. Senator Henry Teller of Colorado was one of the most outspoken opponents of allotment. In 1881, he said that allotment was a policy to despoil the Indians of their land and to make them vagabonds on the face of the earth. Tellers also said the real aim of allotment was to get at the Indian lands and open them up to settlement. The provision for the apparent benefit of the Indians are but to pretext to get at his lands and occupy them. If this were done in the name of greed, it would be bad enough. But to do it in the name of humanity is definitely worse. In 1890, Dawes himself remarked about the incidents of Native Americans losing their land allotments to settlers. I never knew a white man to get his foot on an Indian's land who ever took it off. Wow. The amount of land in Native hands rapidly depleted from some 150 million acres to 78 million acres in 1900. The remainder of the land, once allotted to appointed natives, was declared surplus and sold to non-native settlers as well as railroads and other large corporations. Other sections were converted into federal parks and military compounds. So overall, all this is being a pretendian from the other side of America, not from the black point of view. It's to steal from the Native Americans. Bottom line. We may look at it as just racial appropriation, native appropriation, and we just look at it like, people are just pretending not to be black. But on a large scale, from the beginning, it's just been a scheme, conspiracy, plot to steal from something that you gave them from stealing from them. It's like you stole from them, gave them something, you stole it back. That's the worst. That is actually the worst. I've never heard of none of this shit before. This is something that they definitely don't teach you in school. I know what's the governor or senator? No, the governor down in Florida, DeSantis. I know he would never let this be in the curriculum in any Florida school. Texas as well. I'm actually sad and it's a shame that I'm 42 years old and I never knew none of this, what I just read. I am aware of the treaties. Well, I was aware of the treaties that the United States made with the natives that they reneged on, obviously, because, they always been forced west. Clearly, west is the United States now. So, you stole back from them or whatever. But I didn't know that it was this deep. In the past 5 years, I just realized that my neighboring state, Indiana, is named for the land of the Indians, right? That's one of the places they sent them to, and then they went back and took it again. Clearly, I didn't see not one native person there actually, and it's not like this was such a long time ago. It's not like it was like 400 and 500 years ago. A lot of this happened in the last 150, 200 years or so. Interesting, and again, they don't teach you none of this shit in school. None of it. They teach you dumb shit like Julius Caesar, King Henry III, and Alexander the Great, and Napoleon, and shit like that. That doesn't matter. People that are just tyrants and colonial masters and murderers and things like that. But they won't speak on the real issues and the real things that happen here, the genocide that happened here. And with Thanksgiving just passing, it's just crazy. Mount Rushmore is a land they stole, gave back. They stole it again. Absolutely. The whole fucking country is. I'm gonna play another video about the Dawes Act.
In 1887, the U.S. government enacted a policy that would fundamentally change the lives of Native Americans, known as the Dawes Act. This act, named after Senator Henry Dawes, was a well-intentioned, yet ultimately flawed attempt to assimilate Native Americans into mainstream society. It sought to transform a communal way of life into one of individual land ownership and agriculture. The Dawes Act effectively ended the tribal landholding system that had sustained Native American communities for generations. It divided their lands into individual allotments, parcels of 160 acres given to each family. This privatization was meant to encourage farming and mirror the Euro-American model of agriculture. However, surplus lands, those left after allotments were made, were sold off to non-native settlers, often without the tribe's consent. This resulted in a catastrophic loss of tribal lands. By 1934, Native Americans had lost more than 60% of their lands, a total of 90 million acres, approximately the size of Montana. The act also targeted the very core of Native American culture. By promoting private ownership, it disrupted communal living, eroded cultural traditions, and led to widespread economic hardship. It was a policy of forced assimilation that, rather than fostering integration, served as an instrument of dispossession and cultural disruption. The Dawes Act was finally repealed by the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934. However, the wounds of this policy still linger today. Native American nations continue their struggle to reclaim their cultural heritage, regain their ancestral lands, and heal from the long-lasting effects of the Dawes Act. Thank you for watching 2-Minute History. If you enjoy this video,
There it is. I think one thing that I've learned, besides some of the things that been said in the comments, shout out to Ouija666, is that it is very harmful to be a pretendian, and when you do that, you are further pushing colonization. It may not seem like that, and it may not look like that, and whether if you know it or not, that is what you're doing, because you're pretending to be something you're not. Uh, these people are owed uh, beyond reparation. You could say that the shit was old, but you're continuously still doing these things to these people. You're continuously trying to build pipelines through their tribal land that you gave them. You're the one who gave this shit to them. You're the one who made up the idea to give them this particular place of their own. These people don't have to be quote unquote productive citizens in your society. They don't have to be. They can do what they want, right? Not everyone is meant to be Christian. Not everyone is to think how we all think. For example, we have the Amish people here in the United States, right? Great group of people, right? They don't live by the laws that you live by. I mean, you can govern them by the city and the state laws and things like that if they are to commit a crime, but they don't follow the rules that you follow. They don't live how you live, and they have no wish or desire to. They can. Some of them choose to leave from the family and integrate into the rest of society, but in no way are you forcing these people to do this, right? You're not. You brought them over here and told them that they should have freedom of religion and they should have their own place when they don't have any ancestral ties to this land, right? I feel like that is native land. Why do they get to live the way they want to live and be unbothered, but the natives can't, and they're really from here? I think it has something to do with skin tone and religion, and that's part of the reason why I decided to make this stream, because it's about religion if you really think about it, right? If these people were not a denomination of Christianity, would you give these people this land? Would you allow them to govern themselves? Would you allow them religious freedom? No, you wouldn't. If they were brown, you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it. As I'm watching this, I start thinking about a lot of other things too. Man, if I was Mexican, I would try to get some type of federal granting, um, or something like that. And the reason why I'm saying that, and the reason why I would, is because they're Native Americans. They can prove it. However you look at it, they can prove it through DNA. They can prove it so many different ways. So if I'm them, I'm trying to get my piece of the pie too, because you stole from them as well. You enslaved them as well. You raped them as well. You murdered them as well. You made treaties with them as well that you broke. Um, I would like to touch on Texas. If anyone knows anything about Texas, it has a deep, dark history, right? So we all know that Texas was a part of Mexico at one point. Um, we know that the United States stole Mexico from the United States. Do we know why? It's because of slavery. Um, Mexico invited the Americans in to kind of, I can't think of the right word, because the land in Texas wasn't ready to be lived. It wasn't livable, right? So they brought settlers in to make it basically livable, just to settle the land or whatever. Um, and everything was cool. It was Tejas at that point, and eventually the Americans started bringing slaves in to do the work for them. Mexico didn't like that. Mexico told them that we don't agree with slavery. We don't do that here. So the United States decided to fight about it, and they took it from all because of slavery. Then the borders changed, and Mexico reiterated to them again that if you bring any slaves down here, we will attack you. And they also let the United States know, or any black person know, that if you can make it to Mexico, you are free. So there is a history of Mexico with the transatlantic slave trade. There were slaves there from that way, and they were there from the beginning of time. Well, not the beginning of time, but the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. They have always been there, especially if you're looking at the Gulf Coast, the coastal part of Mexico. If you look there, even still today, there is a lot of black people there and descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, also in the border towns around Texas and Arizona and places like that. If you look deep enough, you'll find remnants of black people still there because of that. A lot of black people ran to Mexico to avoid slavery. So, just a quick historical fact there about slavery and who was for slavery, how we obtained Mexico, things like that. United States has a history of taking things from people. I don't know what the ideology is because some of these things have happened over hundreds of years, obviously, but they break treaties. Um, I want to thank everybody for stopping by. Thank you, Ouija666, the greatest mod ever. Thank you, everybody else who stopped by. Tomorrow, around noon, 11:30, 11:45, 12 o'clock ish, I'll be having another stream about David Koresh and the Waco, Texas tragedy in 1993. Depending on how old you are, you may know a little bit about that. I remember it growing up as a child, so we're going to do a review and stream on that. I'll probably have NJ on here. Hopefully, we can get her on here. She always provides great content, very smart, informative, knows what she's talking about. I know that she'll remember it because she probably was a teenager or a young adult at that time. I mean, me personally, I was maybe 11, 12, some shit like 93. I probably was 11, but she probably was a young adult or a teenager at that point. So I'm sure she can give some in-depth analysis on the situation as always. If not, you can catch me again here on Wednesdays for AAA Podcast Sports. Shout out to all my guys over there: D80, Black V, Turan, Miguel. Who else? Big Chicken, and everybody else over there. I may come back on Friday, a product of the 80s podcast. That's more political, trending topics. A couple of dope albums came out yesterday. So later on today, I may review those on TikTok or make a few videos about those. The Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre Missionary album came out. Pretty dope. And Fat Joe had a good album that came out yesterday too. I can't remember the name of it. I'm gonna listen to them again, give my reviews and my opinions on those. Actually like both of them. So I give my reviews on those. But again, tomorrow I'll be back with the 93 Waco, Texas tragedy. Thank all y'all again for stopping by. Good afternoon, good evening. Have a good one.